Now, the two tendencies toward the mid and the late 16th century, one represented by Mannerism in the work of Romano, and another tendency was the opposite of Mannerism, that is represented by Palladio, by the career of Palladio. Palladio, instead of dramatize, instead of distort classical form, he standardized classical form. He standardized the great achievement of high Renaissance architect into a copyable system, and he published a book. So that's what made Palladio so influential. And there are many architects in the Renaissance period, from early to late Renaissance period, but only Palladio left an ism. So we don't talk about Michelangeloism or Raphaelism. We don't talk about Da Vincism or Leonardoism, but there is a Palladianism. Why? It is because he was copied, because he published a book. And as a result, there were many buildings constructed in the fashion of Palladio. So that we have the term Palladianism in architectural history. So if you want to be influential, don't just design, also publish a book. Palladio started from a humble origin, and he followed kind of medieval apprenticeship, but at age 16 he broke contract and escaped to the city of Vicenza. Vicenza was a suburb, was a rural city belonging to the Venice Republic, right? In the 16th century, Venice was a republic. Just like Michelangelo was tutored and sponsored by the Medici family, Palladio also had a great tutor and financial benefactor. That is the Trissino. Trissino brought him to preeminent intellectual circle of Vicenza. And Trissino also gave him the name Palladio, after the Greek goddess Athena. Known as Pallas Athena, god of wisdom. So Palladio was kind of an artistic name given to a young person whose original name was Andrea, and given by Trissino. And he was also brought to Rome by Trissino. So Palladio had the chance of visiting those great Roman ruins, classical architecture, as well as those modern building by Bramante, by Michelangelo. So by the time of the Palladio, Michelangelo and Raphael, Bramante, those are modern, right? So the word modern actually starts to be used in the Renaissance period. So in the Renaissance period, people started to talk about modern, modernism. It kind of originated in the Renaissance period. Before that, the sense of time is cyclic. People, in the medieval period, people are waiting for the second coming of Jesus Christ. So you don't have a sense of progressive timeline. So you don't have that consciousness about being modern. And it is beginning in the Renaissance period, modern as a historic sense, as well as a term describing the contemporary age, started to be used. It represents a new historical consciousness of the Renaissance period. So he published a book called The Four Books of Architecture by Palladio. This book is important. We know he was not the first architect publishing a book in the Renaissance period. Alberti also published a book in the same fashion as the Roman Vitruvius, the 10 books of architecture. But Alberti's book was not illustrated. It was not very useful for the builder, for the designer. But Palladio's book was illustrated. So this is a illustrated book with illustration of those classical orders, classical buildings, but also not only those historical work, but also his own design. So he also put his own design into this book. And what's more, he gives specific measurement to his drawing. And those measurements make his book and his design and his classification of classical architecture copyable. So people can, if an architect owns a Palladio's 4 books, they can start building just to follow those measurements to prepare the stone blocks. So his book is practical and useful. That is one of the major reasons that makes Palladio really influential. And many buildings were constructed in the manner of Palladio. So Palladio was living in an age when the significance of Venice, the port city, lost its significance as a commercial port. By the time of the mid-16th century, the rural area of the Venice Republic became more and more significant in the economical life of the Venice Republic. Venetian aristocrats began investing in the agrarian economy in the rural area. And Vicenza, the city of Vicenza, not very far from the coastal city of Venice, boomed with architectural construction. So there we have Vicenza, and here we have the great city of Venice. They all belong to the Republic that covers a large area around the coast of the Adriatic Sea. So Palladio designed a lot of villas. Those villas were not urban residents. Those are rural residents supervising large territory of land. And that boom of rural economy, agrarian economy, was due to 2 factors. One was the commercial route dealing with the business and trading with the East was blocked by the rise of the Ottoman Turks. Constantinople was captured by the Turks. And in the 16th century, they were at war with one another, the Turks and the Venice Republic and the rest of Europe. So trading with the East on the land and also through the Mediterranean Sea was not practical anymore. It was not safe because of the loss of Constantinople to the Ottoman Turkish Empire. A second factor was the discovery of the new so-called New World. So there was a new route was discovered to reach China, to reach the East. And that was the result. The result of that was the discovery of the so-called New World, the Americas, that was explored in the late 15th century. And with that great geographical discovery, people now know the Earth is a ball and the Earth is round. You can go to the other end of the world, sailing a different direction. And also you can go to India, go to China by going around Africa. So that sea route that must go through the Mediterranean Sea and goes through the Central Asia and the Palestine, that area was not necessary and it was not safe anymore because of the new political situation. So all that contributed to the reality that drained the wealth from the city of Venice away and fueled the economy of those rural areas. So Venetian bankers and aristocrats began investing in manufacturing and agriculture in its backyard. Investors reclaimed swamps into productive land, initiating an agricultural revolution in the rural area of the Venetian Republic. So they moved to the countryside to oversee their investment, and that is an opportunity for someone like Palladio. Now, it is not practical anymore to construct a palace over many decades. You have to be able to build fast, right? So those people, those bankers were not seeking an architect to build for many decades and to complete a building when they were on their deathbed, right? So they want something that can be accomplished in a few years. So that is what the value of Palladio's standardization of those classical architecture. So he provided his clientele a functional and a utilitarian structure that would lend their country residents with an air of cultivation and grandeur at a modest budget and a modest time for the construction. So he offered those options to build building in the classical fashion. At that time, it represents aristocratic taste, but at the same time, they are not that expensive and they can be constructed within a few years. So the Barbaro villa that you have heard already in the previous lecture, it gives the clients a feeling of owning something like Palazzo del Te by Romano or the Villa Madama by Raphael. It also has yard, had symmetry, had balance, had classical detail. However, it was built much faster than these two early 16th century examples, and it is also much cheaper. The way he made it cheaper is by focusing on the decoration along one main facade. The rest of them he left blank, left undecorated. So in the example of the Villa Barbaro, only the facade facing only the frontal facade is decorated with classical orders, arches, columns, pediments, symmetry, etc. The rest of them were pretty much undecorated. If you compare the completed building with his drawing, you might also notice this is the design, this is the drawing in Palladio's 4 books, you might notice that the sculptural work is also much simplified. In the original design, he put a lot of sculpture on the roof, but in reality, none of them were completed. Only chimneys. The completed building was without those sculptural decoration. He also eliminated that protruding hall. So the frontal facade is pretty much on the same plane of the colonnade. So that part was eliminated. So the result is a pretty simplified design, even compared to his original design work. But it does shows classical features. It used a temple front for a residential architecture, and that is quite something, because for early Renaissance architect, those pediment temple front, they represent the temple. They were not meant to be used in residential architecture. Alberti didn't use pediment and the temple front in his palazzo. But here, the residential architecture was given a element that looks almost like a classical temple. And he also started the kind of much copied design of dividing the facade into 5 sections, right? There's a middle, there are 2 ends. The middle and the 2 ends are higher. And then there are 2 connections in between, which are lower. So this kind of a 5-section division will be copied a lot, after the 16th century. So he started something that would become fashionable. He also painted the interior, but the interior in Villa Barbaro, like those high Renaissance architect, is strengthening the architecture. So he painted those columns, pilasters, columns, pediments, and arches on the wall, strengthening architecture. But occasionally he also paints something that is playful, like here, a dog in front of a painted baluster. And the landscape shows classical ruins as if there's a huge distance behind it. So all those are painted on that wall. And that is more kind of in the spirit of the Mannerism. However, that dog did not disturb the architectural order. So he is somewhere in between those, Raphael, somewhere in between Raphael and Romano, in terms of treating the relationship between painting and architecture. So that also gives this kind of a relatively not as luxurious building a sense of luxury and elevated status. Palladio's most influential and most famous work is the Villa Rotunda. And Villa Rotunda, like Villa Barbaro, it is also a villa. It is in the rural area, in the suburb of Vicenza. So here he designed a centralized form, like what Michelangelo dreamed for St. Peter's. So it's a concentric, centralized form. Completed in 1552. It has loggia, those porchway from which one can have a great view of the surrounding area on all 4 sides. So there are loggia on all the 4 sides. And the plan featured square and circle kind of relationship, almost like the St. Peter's by Michelangelo. In the center is a circular hall and a square perimeter, and 4 loggias provide the space to overlook the estate from all direction. So it's kind of very classical. And he made those temple front an important part of the architectural image. Now, those elements only used in classical temples are permanently installed in residential architecture. Palladio, kind of celebrating the idealized form of circle and square in the same high Renaissance spirit, said in his book, the most beautiful and regular form, and form from which others receive their measure are the round and the rectangular. By rectangular, he meant square. So here, square and circle is significant in his design, and he cast them into a timeless model that provide example for much architecture to come. So if we compare Villa Rotunda by Palladio and another villa by Giuliano da Sangalo from almost a century ago, we noticed that in both cases, the square shape was used. Da Sangalo used a peristyle colonnade to circulate the whole lower floor. It is basically square, and the division of interior space, division of the 4 quarters into those apartments seems a little chaotic, not as regularized. And the central hall does not have that circular, centralized circle form. Palladio's Villa Rotunda had a much clearer and a much more powerful expression of that Renaissance spirit, of those centralized form and the use of idealized shapes of square and circle, like what Michelangelo did to Bramante design of the St. Peter's. So it's a, yeah, that's Michelangelo's design. From outside, Da Sangalo already adopted a temple front, but in that villa, the temple front was only part of the facade. It's only provide a porch to the entrance, and Palladio extended that temple front to become the main image of the facade. And in this case, there's no main facade anymore. All the 4 facades are pretty much identical. And what he did to the classical form that was revolutionary for his time is the use of a dome in residential architecture. Sangalo did not use a dome for his villa. So it is the first time a dome was used in a residential architecture. No matter in medieval period or in the classical antiquity or early and high Renaissance, no architect had put a dome unless it is a church or a temple. And Villa Rotunda is the first residential architecture utilizing a dome. And that is something kind of a gesture of elevating these more kind of economic villas to a luxurious look. that certainly should please his client, give their residents a higher status compared to their modest budget. In his design, Palladio was meant to feature the dome even higher. So this is his design. And in his original design, he was also meant to open windows in the dome. But the completed building adjusted it. The dome was hidden more behind a drum, a busting wall. And that dome seems not as high as his original intention. And those windows were also eliminated. So that the completed work is obviously a simplification of his original design. So from his drawing published in his 4 books, it is obvious Palladio was meant to feature a dome and a temple front, kind of combining the Greek temple with the Roman pantheon. It's like a combination of Parthenon and Pantheon. And that the using of a rotunda certainly reminded people of the great Roman monument of the Pantheon. So this is under the rotunda, inside of the rotunda, circular drum, circular wall supporting a circular dome, which is very straightforward. It's the same fashion as the Pantheon. And the architectural sculpture and painting kind of strengthen the architectural element, but at the same time, he painted the figures, those god and goddess, as if they were floating in front of the architecture. So all of them are painted on the wall, of course. So he was somewhere in between Raphael and Romano. But he standardized things. He standardized those classical motifs and he published them in a book, and that book was copied widely. He also created some architectural motif, not only a complete architecture, but just some element that can be copied and repeated to cover any architectural facade. In his renovation of the Basilica in Vicenza, so this is a civic building, this is a town hall. Palladio was called upon to refurbish its public facade surrounded by the street and square. What he did was to give it a classical face, and he just designed one element and repeat that element to cover the whole surface of the facade. And that element became known as the Palladian Motif. It was published in Serliana's treatise, published also in Serliana's treatise. And so that motif is also Serlio's, in Serlio's treatise on architecture. So that motif is also known as Serliana. But Palladio popularized that motif and used it, provided an example how to use that motif to dress up a large building without much effort, right? So what is the characteristic of this Palladian motif? It is characterized by a combination of an arch and a Greek order, right? And it is also characterized by an overlapping of a giant order with a secondary order. So there is a hierarchy. So we have this columns in the base scale. Then within it, we have another smaller column in the same order, but in a diminished scale to work with that arch. And so he articulates different layers to cover the facade, and each layer is divided by the entablature that has a frieze, architrave, and cornice. Use that to divide it to provide the framework for the facade division. And within each division, he used the Palladian motif that combine arch with column to fill that space. And each bay is basically filled by the same motif. So it became a motif. And though that motif was copied very much, and even some modernist building, like those Chicago style high-rise, the window division is inspired by this kind of Palladian motif using more modern material of cast iron. So it was influential. It was copied not only in the following centuries of 17th, 18th, 19th, but also as late as the early 20th century. So that Palladian motif is very satisfying, also because he created a very interesting figure and ground relationship. It's almost like the yin and yang Taiji diagram, right? So here we can see the lower half is like the yin, and the upper half is like the yang. The bright wall and the dark empty space. But within the bright wall, he put those dark window, and within the dark space, he put those bright column, just like what is, represented in that kind of mutually embracing relationship between yin and yang element. It is balanced, but it also has diversity. It also expresses a kind of timeless relationship between contrasting elements. So this became known as the Palladian motif. Palladio also designed church in the city of Venice, especially. So I'm going to move faster for this part, but highlight just some key element. What he did was to kind of compromise centralized plan with a longitudinal Latin cross. That is what he was attempting here. He was also trying to make compromise between a medieval interior space and the new fashion of classical Renaissance classical form. He was living in an age when the church tried to get back some ground from the reformist religious reform led by Martin Luther in the 16th century, created a reaction from the church. So that now the church considered those Reformation as some kind of rebellion and try to claim a orthodox spatial form by utilizing more kind of Latin cross longitudinal interior. And the compromise made in the St. Peter's was a result of later reconstruction that altered Michelangelo's original kind of a centralized plan. And Palladio, in his new design, he compromised these forms, right? So he create a longitudinal kind of basilica interior, at the same time using dome to highlight a centralized central area. His design was very similar. There were a bunch of churches designed by Palladio in the city of Venice alone. This one is Il Redentore, and this is San Francisco della Vigna, and this is the west facade of the San Giorgio Maggiore. So they are all in Venice, and they look almost identical. So when you visit the city of Venice, you will be very confused. You see a building that looks as if you have seen it somewhere, but it's in a totally different environment, totally different part of the city. And those are the building designed by Palladio. So Palladio, what did he do? He basically used classical dress to cover an ecclesiastical space, right? So he used classical pediment temple front to cover an interior space that features a high nave and a lower aisle. Not all these church has an aisle in the medieval sense, but it is a medieval spatial plan, longitudinal basilica. And he used classical order to give it a face. This is very different from the way Gothic gave a face to that space, right? Now, Palladio used the classical vocabulary to cover a medieval plan. He also compromised the medieval plan by giving it a prominent dome, and that indicates the legacy of the Michelangelo centralized plan, and that is Palladio's approach to church during the New Age, basically. So that's something that I wanted to highlight. You can, pause and look at these slides on your own in greater detail compared to your textbook, right? So the interior space, compromise of Latin cross with centralized plan, the interior. And the great influence of Palladio on Palladianism. So architecture from the 18th century, from the early 19th century in the New World, in America, are influenced by Palladio's Villa Rotunda.